Hello, everyone. This is Luke Johnson from Noetic.online, the humanities, social media application and website. Today, we are doing installment 15 of Soren Kierkegaard's Training in Christianity. Bob Schut, what are we talking about?
Oh, well, today we have to reflect on last lesson where we spoke about a young man that Kierkegaard kind of creates fictitiously who wanted to live in accord with the pattern of what he calls perfection, but a perfection that came from his imagination. Eventually, he develops this imagination, this perfect imagination, into the form of Christ. So now this young man is living what he considers to be the life of perfection. Well, he's trying to, that's the idea, of trying to live to perfection as Christ reflected it. And now he's also become a little bit more mature, and he considers the idea of exactly how suffering fits into all of this. The idea of God and suffering. So, first of all, I wanted to bring up, Luke, is that I noticed that in the little box I have where I see my own reflection, it looks like I'm wearing a sequence shirt. As I move back and forth, it seems to be like glittery.
I thought they were constellations.
No, I just want to assure you and everybody, this is not a shirt made of sequins. It's actually just black and white, but the white seems to be fluttering on its own.
You naturally sparkle, Bob.
Oh, maybe that's what it is. Okay. So Kierkegaard tells us, he says, okay, at this point, things now begin to become serious. This young man is kind of deep into this goal that he's looking for. He's so deep that he just can't give it up. So he's kind of, I guess, in a sense, committed to this idea of living the perfect life. If he does not give it up, he will resemble the opposite of exaltation, which is humiliation. Why? Well, because glory for truth is only exalted in a world of truth, where Christ is now in an exalted state. So what he's saying here, Kierkegaard is telling us that when you try to live a life of exaltation in the world, where the truth is the highest thing, it doesn't go well with the world, because the world of truth exists only in the exalted state where Christ currently is. So the world doesn't respect this truth, nor does it pursue after such truth. And I think that both you and I, Luke, have experienced that, I think, in our lives, that we know that when we set out to live a life of truth and preach a life of truth, we wind up kind of in a difficult situation when it comes to the world.
I'm pretty sure the mob's going to force me to drink hemlock before I reach my 40s.
Well, we'll be either that or the Kool-Aid. Huh? Just stay away from the Kool-Aid. When we resemble the truth in a world of untruth, it brings about loneliness and humiliation. And this makes life serious when one walks in truth, for it will bring about suffering. But he will not give up because he's a Christian. So, it becomes serious, and that's what we kind of said a little earlier. Why does it become serious? Well, because suffering now enters into the picture. And because he believes he's a Christian and he's living a Christian life, he's just not going to give it up. Which means suffering is now part of his life. But because he's a little naive and maybe a bit of a dreamer, he still thinks things can get better. And he asks the question, will God not help him to conquer? And his answer is, yes, he will. But in the world of truth, but in this world, truth conquers by suffering and by defeat. So Kierkegaard is giving us a little different way to look at suffering. How do you conquer suffering? You conquer it through suffering and defeat. which he's going to give an explanation of how does suffering defeat help me to conquer something. And the youth doesn't understand this concept. He says, isn't God supposed to be a loving God? Isn't that what everybody tells me? So how can you tell me suffering and defeat are part of my life now when God's supposed to come to my rescue? So what the youth expected was good times, blessings, etc. But it isn't happening. Well, maybe worldly rewards, maybe he's expecting worldly rewards for being a Christian. So Kierkegaard would not exactly buy into the gospel of prosperity here. He tends to think, or just telling us, that prosperity is not a sign of Christianity. Suffering is a sign of Christianity.
Yeah, I would say who's serving who by the elevation they have in this world. It's a good sign. It makes it a little bit easier to know whose side you're on.
Yes, it does. But there will come an instant when he sees the context of his suffering in the situation, and this is what Kierkegaard calls that state of seriousness. When you finally realize that your expectation of good times and blessings, etc., and prosperity come crashing down, that's when things get serious. And as he grows, he's going to learn all of this. As he matures, he's going to learn eventually that there's no end to suffering. It's not like, well, when I become a mature Christian, God's really going to reward me with the big house and the nice car, plenty of money in the bank, and so forth. That's just not a Christian dream. That's not the way a Christian should expect his life to turn out. Not that our lives sometimes don't turn out that way. That's a blessing, and it truly is. But when we expect it, it really changes the meaning of everything. It changes what it means in our life. When one is living in luxury, one can read about such things like suffering, and they might even shed a tear, yet still have peace, not being moved by the story. Here he's talking about somebody who has sympathy, but not empathy. So they can kind of look back and say, yeah, well, it's not happening to me, and I can afford to shed a tear for this person. Isn't this so sad, But he doesn't have empathy. He really can't relate to it because he doesn't experience it. If one is in suffering, one can certainly understand the story better. But when you're not suffering, it's like watching somebody, who's in pain. It's kind of hard to feel their pain. You can watch them, you can see their face, you can see maybe the bruising or whatever, but you just don't feel it. And this is what makes it kind of difficult to have empathy for someone. You have to really remember what it felt like when you had pain. And if you've never had pain, well, then how do you really know what that person is feeling? So at this point in suffering, will one let this picture go now? Will this guy finally say, well, wait a second, if you're promising me a lifetime of suffering, maybe I shouldn't, maybe being a Christian isn't the right way to go. Maybe I do need to go after this gospel of prosperity. Maybe that's a little better. So, but he realizes, at least in Kierkegaard's story here, but the young man realizes he can't do anything else. Let the sufferings come. I still have my hope in God, but perhaps now I have it in a little different way. So one of the reasons is that he looks at the pattern, and he not only sees the perfection in the pattern, but now he sees how Jesus handled suffering. So he sees the pattern a little more deeply than he saw it before. He realizes that he also must bear this in the same way that Jesus bore it. So when we look at suffering, we want to reflect back to the pattern, which with a capital P, and see, how did Jesus handle his suffering? Did he have pain? Did he cry? Did he have spiritual pain?
Well, all that. Yeah, I was going to say, all this presumes that this sort of suffering that Jesus experienced was of the same type, the same species. I mean, I think we could say that Jesus experienced a multiplicity of sufferings, right? He had to sort of come to some sort of understanding of the whole range of human experience, right?
Absolutely, he did. He did. And he suffered types of experience. It's not like he suffered every possible human experience, but he suffered types of experience and enough to give us a pattern, which is what the most important thing is here. I mean, of course, Jesus didn't go through childbirth. He couldn't. It doesn't mean that there's something missing, but he went through physical pain, extreme physical pain, which is a type. So we can understand that.
Well, the one that's most curious to me, and I hope it comes up in our conversation, I've lately been very intrigued by, Jesus's foreknowledge of his crucifixion, and there's the moment when he's praying to God to let this pass from him, that he shouldn't have to carry through this burden, and that special type of suffering of knowing his certain future and wanting to escape it. And I think about that a lot of times too. Like we've talked about how you and I, because we have prioritized truth, we have set ourselves against the multitudes.
Right.
And this has made me very unpopular. There's been a lot of persecution that's come with this. I've often said to myself, can someone else have this role? I've done what I can for this period of time. I'm ready to be, Coach, can you put somebody else in? Yeah. Are you going to talk about that particular sort of suffering at all?
Yes, actually we are. We are.
Good.
So maybe there'll be some questions at that point. Matter of fact, we're going to talk a little bit about it right now. God is supposed to be loving. So how could he have deserted Christ while he was on the cross, remember? Which we'll get into the specifics of it. But this is the one moment that help was needed most. When Christ was on the cross, suffering. Everybody had run away from him and left him, except for a few people. And this is when he really needed God the most, and God deserted him. So how do we make sense of that?
Well, I mean, I guess I would question whether or not that would even be possible for God to desert Christ while he was on the cross. It may only from a very finite perspective could we say that God deserted Christ on the cross. I mean, because that would involve, it's just nonsensical because Christ is God. He can't desert himself.
Right. And in a way, that's absolutely true. But his father, let's say put it this way, be more distinct. What right. Kierkegaard is speaking about is that spiritual desertion that he felt that God had not, that God let him die, in so many words. That God brought him to this point and nothing happened to change the situation. He didn't miraculously fly off the cross, or have a substitution like some people think. Jesus actually suffered death. And this is and the problem with that is it offends people's theology, so they have to change the events rather than change their theology here. But we need to, Kierkegaard, I love him because he doesn't do that. He takes the most difficult event in Scripture and he just dives right into it, and he doesn't give up with it until an answer falls out for him. And usually it satisfies me as well. So how do we resolve this issue? Suppose now that this young man grows old. Even if God should desert him, it would be for only an instant. For only an instant. When you consider eternity. So when you weigh the balances and you have God with you for your whole life, except for that short period of time, what would you rather have? No God at all? Or would you rather have God with you for the majority of the time and maybe desert you for a moment? And that's what Kierkegaard is saying. We want to weigh these things.
Yeah, but I want to split hairs thing. I don't think God deserted Christ ever. Not even for an instant. I I think it's blasphemous to say that God ever deserts us.
Okay, well, this is a term that Kierkegaard uses. Let me see. Just look up one thing.
Mainly because our whole existence is sustained by him. Mainly because our whole existence is sustained by him. He can't desert us. If he were to desert us, we would be annihilated.
The actual quotation. What I wanted to find was the actual quotation is, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? So when we say deserted, what we actually should probably say is forsaken. Jesus felt forsaken of God. Now, theologically, we might challenge whether he really was or wasn't, but we can't prove one way or the other. We can only say this is what Jesus quoted. He quoted a psalm when he said this. And if we read the whole psalm, it makes a little bit more sense how it's taken in context. But for now, let's just follow through Kierkegaard's reasoning that, okay, this event of desertion or forsakenness only existed for a moment. So when he considers eternity, he's not going to give it up, his Christianity, for the sake that it's only for a little moment, he can bear it. And Kierkegaard says the real thing is because he can do nothing else. He has become who he wished to become. So the question is, how sincere is our Christianity? Is it something that we place on a what would I say? Can't think of a good word for it. In a situation where if the crisis becomes too great, we're ready to cash in the chips and give it up. But for a real Christian, he's not going to give it up for any reason, even if someone should hold a sword to his throat. He's not going to say, well, God, I didn't get into this for this reason here. I didn't expect this to happen, and give it up. No, a real Christian doesn't give it up because he knows eternity is at stake. And so it's bigger than the question of whether or not I'm forsaken for a moment or whether I'm not forsaken for the moment. It's something that, in Paul's words, once you've tasted of this glorious gift, you can't give it up. It's something beyond choice. In so many words, is I think where Kierkegaard and where Paul go with this. If he holds out to the last, then he stood the test. He stood his test to be Christ and drawn by him from above. He gets through suffering by telling himself that in a little while he's going to be perfected. Whether a little while or many years in the scheme of eternity is a little while. So the point Kierkegaard is making here is that it's not about, we can't change the point of view of the goal to be accepted by the world or to become successful in the world. The point of view here is to be perfected. So that's the whole point. That has to rise to the top, Luke. That's on the top of the scale, to be perfected by God. Okay, so that's what gets him through. So we all ask the question, why did God desert Christ? The issue, however, Kierkegaard says, is why did Jesus not give up? Why did he say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And then into your hands I commit my spirit. Why didn't he say, my God, you have forsaken me. I'm done with this. Get me down. Get me out of here. Why didn't he say that?
Because Jesus was super smart and knew that it only looked like God had forsaken him and that he wasn't really forsaken.
Well, we might say that, or Kierkegaard is saying here, is that he understood that the being forsaken was part of his perfection. And we're going to find that out in a little while. He didn't give up because he couldn't give up. He loved his father and trusted him in the same way that Isaac trusted Abraham. This was a symbol of what was to come. He was being tested as Job was tested, to prove his faith to everyone, to prove his faith to everyone except to God. Now, this is really worth looking into. So, we have a story of Abraham and Isaac. Now, you remember the story. I know you do, because Kierkegaard makes sure we don't forget it. And Isaac is laying there.
I've heard it from multiple perspectives. Yeah.
Right. But Isaac, the story is Isaac is lying down, and he's got his hands tied behind him. And Abraham lifts up the knife, ready to thrust it into. And Isaac is okay with this. There's no evidence that Isaac was trying to escape or trying to get away or saying, "Father, what are you doing? You're crazy. You're a fanatic." No, Isaac lies there still. From the story told the way we know. This is a foreshadow of the crucifixion, Luke. And I didn't realize that until Kierkegaard mentioned this. He didn't say this exactly, but he kind of put the idea in my mind that is a foreshadow of Christ on the cross. He's bound. He's lying there. Death is about to happen. And he doesn't curse his father, and he doesn't try to run away. And then we have the story of Job, which is also a foreshadow of the crucifixion. Job loses everything. God takes everything away. Now, why did he do that? He did that to prove Abraham's faith, to prove Isaac's faith, and to prove Job's faith. But now, I'm going to ask you a question. Who did he prove faith to? Remember now, God knows everything. So, who did Abraham prove his faith to?
Oh, that's a very simple question. Let me just give you a very simple answer. Well, I'm not sure that. Well, I guess what I'm trying to say here, it's a question of what are the things that God knows in His omnipotence, right?
Yeah.
And this gets into questions of election and free will and things of these nature. So, at least in the case of Abraham and Isaac, the faith may have been proven to God. In the case of Job, the dynamic's different because the dynamic in Job is a wager with Satan.
Yeah.
And it seems like God is trying to prove something to Satan rather than have Job prove something to him. Or maybe both of them are going on. But I'm not certain that it's incompatible to say that God is omnipotent, yet there's still room for individuals to prove their faith to Him. I guess it's a question of what is God's omnipotence of? Is it omnipotence of events, or solely, or is it an omnipotence of the internal agency of the actors that bring about those events as well?
Okay. Well, what I could tell you this. You kind of froze up a little bit. I think I got most of your question there. What would you do with it if I told you that they were proving it not to God, but they were proving it to mankind? In other words, the proof is not, and the test is not like pass or fail in God's eyes, because God already knows what you're going to do. But God puts these people there in order to prove their faith, to show their faith in the sense of proving and testing. Jesus was there as an example of faith. He wasn't proving his faith to God. God already knew, like you said, God couldn't be tested in that sense. But the test was for us. It tests us.
Do you really think that God makes us put on these faith displays primarily for the rest of humanity? It may be a side effect, it may be a secondary manifestation of it or a secondary purpose of it, but do you think that's the primary purpose?
I think that the primary purpose is to prove his faith. but it proves it to himself and it proves it to others. It doesn't really, I don't think primarily proves it to God. I think God is showing, he's displaying faith. At least in the case of Abraham, Isaac, and Jesus and Job, the faith is something to be displayed. Because remember the story of Job, God takes the challenge of Satan. Satan comes and remember he says, yeah, Job is a believer. Why? Well, because you gave him everything. Of course he believes. So God says, go ahead. Take everything away except his life. That was confidence. He had confidence in Job. It wasn't saying, well, I don't know. Job, I got my fingers crossed. I hope you pull this off for me because I got a lot at stake here. I got this big wager with the devil. I don't think that God actually has a wager. God knew that Job would pull it off. And he was showing the devil, showing Satan what faith really is. But let's continue on anyway. Let's see how this goes.
I want to register this concern, though. I think there's something really theologically problematic about our faith being a show for other individuals and not a dynamic
not a show.
display
Hold on.
for God.
Okay, let me change your word from show to example. Okay, and that's going to fall out here in a minute. This is the test to not only become, but to remain a Christian through suffering. It's not Christianity or the Christ who is the source of this cruelty of suffering. It is that he must live in this world. And he says that Christ is not so gentle and weak that he would take the Christian out of the world. Why? Because it's in the world that he's tested and made perfect. This is why the key issue is, how are we made perfect? By God giving us everything? By God answering everything we should ask for? By God helping us to be wealthy and successful and healthy? Is that how our faith is made perfect? No. It's by the tests that we're made perfect. That's this whole section that Kierkegaard is trying to say. And how and who do we look to for an example of such a thing? Whose faith is made perfect through suffering? Jesus.
Again, I'm sorry to be so quarrelsome about these issues. I'm not. Are we certain that? Are we certain that Jesus has faith in the same way that you and I have faith?
Well, it says that his faith was made perfect through his suffering, is what the scripture tells us about Jesus. His faith was made. He was made perfect through his suffering, and Kierkegaard is picking up on that issue. That it's through suffering.
But what do you think? I mean, we can't possibly have the same type of faith as Jesus.
We have to have the same faith as Jesus.
But we can't be because we aren't Christ.
Well, what does Christ different? What does he have different than we have?
He's part of the Trinity.
Okay, but now you're depending upon a theological point of view. What does Scripture tell us about Jesus that makes him different? And even in the Trinity, it says he's fully human. How can he be fully human if he doesn't experience faith? And by his exclamation on the cross, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" Doesn't he display that? Doesn't he show he was fully human and had faith just like you and I? Because if he had super duper faith, then he's not a model for us, is he?
I mean, the thing is, if we say that he's fully human, what I'm saying, I think we're doing violence to his divinity. It's an issue that we've gone back and forth with before about overcompensating for one end or the other. If we make him too divine, he can't properly manifest, and if he becomes too human, he manifests too much, where he's not the logos that was with God in the beginning.
Mm-hmm. This is where we come into what Kierkegaard would probably call a collision with the paradox, with a capital P. If you're trying to make sense of it, Luke, you're not going to answer the question, because there is no answer to that question. It rises above the question.
Well, I would say this. I think he can have something beyond faith, because he's got to have something beyond faith, as if he was with God from before time began, before creation even was. Like, he can have this super duper, whatever we're calling faith, and yet it can still be a model for us. I don't have a problem with it being in a higher category, yet something we aspire to and yet don't attain here.
Well, if we see it from different points of view, we can see something from the bottom up and we can see something from the top down and look at the same thing, but see it differently because we see two different sides of it. What we ought to do here, and this is my opinion, what we ought to do is see here on the crucifixion and in the physical life of Christ, his full humanity, and see that and focus upon that. Not let his divinity get in the way of what we need to see. God gave us something. He gave us the Christ in order for us, because he knew our needs. And our needs is to have a model. And so we have to see him as that model. The only way we can see him as that model is to see him as fully human. If we try to see him from the other side, we can't see both sides at the same time, is what I'm trying to say.
But if that were the case, if that were the case, if we just needed a fully human example of faith, there are plenty of other martyrs that we could focus on.
Well, they may be martyrs, but Jesus wasn't a martyr. We have to see his...
He is a martyr.
Okay. Yeah. We have to see his humanity in the context of his divinity. But that doesn't reduce his humanity. It's just the context of his humanity. I probably can't wrap around that for now, but let me
keep going.
Okay. So for us, God has put it in our minds and in our hearts to see his humanity. We really can't grasp the idea of the Trinity. We can say it, we can define it, we can, put it into words, but we really can't grasp the meaning of it, nor should we be able to grasp the meaning of it. Because at this point, Kierkegaard says, we see Christ going through his humility, not his exaltation. So we have to see him go through the humility at this point. He emptied himself, the kenosis, in theological terms. Jesus emptied himself of all that exaltation stuff. He's no longer an exalted being. He's totally in the humility of being a man. He took upon himself being a man, according to Philippians. So this is what we're seeing right now in his earthly visit. He is a man. He has to be. Now, we know him because of what happened before and what happened after. We know him to be in the context of divinity. But we can't visit that on him at this point. Or he never would have, like you said, if he was not fully human and he was acting divine, like half one and half the other, he never could have said or would have said, "Why hast thou deserted me? Why, my God, why hast thou abandoned me?" He couldn't possibly have said that. And that's why I think you can't grasp that of what he said and what he meant. And we have to kind of look at it and redefine it. But we understand it that we have to grasp Jesus right now in the sense of his humility as being fully human in that context. Okay, for now, let's continue on. Maybe it'll help, maybe not. We'll see. The world is cruel, but it is used by God to make him perfect. It is frightful to discover that truth is persecuted. It is not as we were told as a child. This is Kierkegaard's words. So what Kierkegaard is saying, of course, is that as a child you're told, hey, keep your nose clean, do the right things, always tell the truth, and the world will, reward you for it. And we know that that's just not the case. The world doesn't reward people who tell the truth. punishment is usually, or humiliation is not too far behind. The God-man, okay, Jesus, knows within himself with eternal certainty that he is the truth. And yet he knows with certainty that he is persecuted. Yet he does not suffer inwardly. So what Kierkegaard here is telling us is that he does suffer outwardly. And he allows himself to suffer outwardly. And by all intents and purposes, he is being forsaken by God, physically speaking. Yet, internally, inwardly, he is not suffering. He's at peace with all of this because he knows that this is working not only to make him perfect, but to make those who have faith in him perfect as well. He knows that every instance that he is in the truth, as each Christian must also be, that he, in an imperfect way, relates himself to the truth. Okay, go ahead. You were going to say something, so I'll stop for a moment.
So this goes back to my initial concern about the spiritual turmoil that Jesus may have had when he wanted this burden to pass from him. I forget the exact expression about "let this cup pass from my lips," right? So is what Kierkegaard is saying here is that Jesus never experienced any sort of depression, sullenness, anxiety about the ordeal that he would have to undergo of being of knowing that he was going to have to be crucified and that he was have to be hated by the world.
I think that, yeah, I'm not sure I got all your question, but Jesus knew he was going to be tortured. He knew he was going to be crucified. He understood it, if not through his own intuition, at least the scriptures foretold of it. So he could have got it one of two ways or both ways. So he knew that his end was going to be suffering and torment.
But he had no inner turmoil.
No, he did have inner turmoil. Inner turmoil doesn't mean that he didn't have an inner peace, knowing what it was going to bring. Okay. In other words, well, this is kind of like the battle that goes on within each of us. I mean, I have my times that I'm in depression. I shed my tears. I wonder, God, where are you? I might say the same prayer once in a while. But always and always is the answer to that prayer is, I am with you. And right. You are this is part of your walk. This isn't something in addition to it that I'm punishing you. This is your walk. And I keep having to learn that lesson. Jesus also, in a sense, says that he learned through his suffering. Perhaps he was learning the same thing as well. What appeared to be a turmoil, what appeared to be something that outwardly was going to be horrific, was actually part of his walk. If you possibly can remove this cup from me, but nevertheless, not my will, but thine. So he, in his question, as essential as it was, the answer was in the question. And that's something that I've found through my life. Sometimes the answer is really in the question. If you're not afraid to look at that question deep enough, you'll find the answer in that question. So I think Jesus himself found the answer in his question. He was honest with himself. And that's another reason to respect Jesus. He was so honest about this all. He didn't put on a false sense of bravado. He cried drops like blood because he was afraid of what he had to suffer. And he went with this fear. He let the fear, said, yeah, this is a reality for me. What am I going to do, Father? And the answer was, not my will, but yours.
I completely agree. And I think you've elucidated it clearly. My concern is that some of the things that we were talking about would commit us to a completely tranquil and serene inner life of Jesus, therefore taking away some aspect of the human suffering. Yeah. But what we're really trying to say here is that that the human being is a complicated, multifaceted individual, and the depression, the mental anguish, and all of those things can coexist with the serenity that faith and trust also brings.
Yes.
And that is a very complicated psychological milieu.
It is. I think that, I don't know if I should say it this way here, but Jesus probably would have been a very bad Buddhist monk, because Buddhist monks aren't supposed to do that. They're supposed to be elevated above everything. And sometimes we picture Jesus that way. That's the fantasy way of seeing Jesus, as he was above all of this. It's like he walked on water, so he always walked on water. He was above all of this, but he wasn't. He was right in the middle of it. He had to be in the middle of it. He felt all this fear and anxiety, and he dealt with it.
Right. Well, yeah, I think there are forces at work that want to make Buddha into some sort of Eastern Jesus, when what we're seeing, in this
and
conversation,
vice
what
versa.
it's portraying, right? What this conversation is revealing is that Jesus is doing a concentration, intensification of the self that keeps all of these complex emotions nested together. Whereas sort of the Buddhist mindset, it's to destroy the self, where Jesus's self is growing.
Yes.
Faith.
Yes. Well put, my brother. Well put. You nailed it. Okay, but he is aware with fear and trembling, and that with every step he takes is risk. He risks everything at every step of his faith. That's us. Every step we take, we risk everything because we don't know the future. It might be easier if the world thought well of him, but this is not the case. He shudders with fear and trembling, struggling to be more unselfish and devoted to God. And this is what happens to a Christian, he says, in Christendom. Why? Because, in Christendom, even the church is against him. He's accused of not being a Christian, for he does not treat Christianity as a thing that needs to be hidden within the man. You see, for probably the same reasons that we're talking about. He doesn't walk around with robes on and with a halo over his head, oblivious to all this pain. He's not, the monk that you can put needles in his arms and he feels nothing. He's a man of tears, a man of persecuted. He's a man. And like you said, he's a complete man because he's accepting all the parts of the man. And he's allowing God to make use of every piece of his being to perfect him. It's like saying, Lord, use my depression to make me better. And that's what Jesus is modeling for us. We have to do the same thing. If there were no pattern for him to look at, meaning if there were no Jesus, he would not be able to hold out in his suffering. It's by this pattern that he sees love and perfection through love. So it's not, how are we perfected, Luke? When we think about it, how are we made better? And we go back to the prosperity thing. Are we made better when our lives are going smooth? Are we made always better when we're getting everything we ever prayed for? Are we becoming better people? Or are we becoming more vain? Here Kierkegaard is saying, you are perfected. Your love, not you. Your love is perfected through the pattern of Christ, through going through persecution. That's what perfects your love.
I was going to say, I don't know. It's been a while. It's been a while since I've had excess to indulge in.
Yeah, well.
If God wants to put me through that spiritual trial of giving me everything, I wouldn't turn him down.
If he's taking volunteers, you're on that line, right?
Yeah. Let's see what happens when Luke gets everything he wants.
Yeah, that would be scary, Luke. I'm not sure we're going to go there. Okay, that is divine. In other words, Kierkegaard here is speaking about divine love is perfected, which is different from human love. This is a relationship between exaltation and loneliness, which is what Christ had to deal with, which is what we were kind of on the edge of. The humiliation is the now this is we have to follow this. This is a little hard to follow, but let's see what happens. The humiliation, we're speaking about the humiliation and the exaltation. He says it's like a reflected image. When you have one, you have the other as a reflection. Kind of like when you see yourself in a pool of water. You see kind of two realities. You see who you are, or you think who you are, and you see your reflection in the water. So it's like these two things happen simultaneously, that they exist. Like I was saying, two sides of something. This is what Kierkegaard speaks about as the reflected image. To be a true Christian is the highest exaltation, although it's reflected in the world as the deepest humiliation. So we have this paradox. We have to understand this as a paradox, where yes, there is an exaltation simultaneously happening with humiliation, so that the two are the same but differ only in how they seem or how they appear to be. The humiliation of a true Christian is not supported by the recognition of other people. So it's not what other people exactly reflect about us that is really who we truly are. This humiliation that we go through is really a reflection of exaltation. We're exalted by the humiliation that we experience. This Christian is here upon the earth, and therefore is the exaltation of him who draws him. So the individual is drawn by the exalted Christ. So we have these two things happening simultaneously. And my final note for today is, because it's reflected in the world, it becomes seen as humiliation. So we are exalted, Luke, as Christian beings. You and I are in an exalted state. However, because we live in this world, it is seen as humiliation and experienced as humiliation by us. Because this world is not fit for the world of exaltation. That's why Jesus is drawing us out of the world with exaltation. So this is kind of where I'm going to leave it for now. But what do you think about Kierkegaard's point of view here on the simultaneous paradoxical existence of exaltation and humiliation?
It makes more sense to me now more than it ever did before. I like it. I like
Good.
it. I can just
Good.
like it. I can like it.
I like it too. And I think we both like it because we experience it. It rings true to both of us, doesn't it?
Yes, very, very much so. Very much makes me desire for the realities to converge.
Mm-hmm.
For the it is quite the trial to live in two worlds at once. I would like for the realities to come together again.
Yeah, we will, but not in this life.
Right. I don't know. I think a lot of interesting things are going down.
So, we will see.
We'll see. All right. Thank you, Bob. I appreciate the conversation. Spirited,
thank you, my friend.
Educative, all at the same time. You have a wonderful evening, and I will edit this and have the audio up on all the conventional platforms of YouTube, SoundCloud, and the Apple Podcasting app, but also over at Noetic.online. Please be a beta tester over there. We need all the feedback we can get. I've got some very important jobs to accomplish in the fall, and I need your feedback. All right. Thank you, Bob.
You're welcome. Take care, my brother.
All right.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.